Ever read a definition of poetry and it's like, yeah, rhymes and all, but
It's always more than that, right?
totally. And that's what we're digging into, how people actually describe poetry, not just the textbook stuff.
Right, right.
We've got all these quotes from Brainy Quote,
Okay.
everyone from like Plato
Wow.
to Bob Dylan. See what they thought poetry really is.
That's a huge range. I'm curious to see what we find.
Me too. Okay, this one grabbed me right away. Edgar Allan Poe. The rhythmical creation of beauty.
Yeah.
It's about the effect, not just the words themselves.
It's like how Plutarch said, painting is silent poetry and poetry is painting that speaks. They both go for that emotional impact.
But in such different ways. A painting hits you all at once, but a poem...
It unfolds over time.
Exactly.
And it uses the sound of language, the music of it, in a way that painting can't.
Okay, now this one's a head-scratcher, but in a good way. Carl Sandburg. Poetry is an echo, asking a shadow to dance.
Ooh!
What does that even mean? It's like poetry gives life to things that aren't even there.
It's giving the intangible, like a shadow agency. It's not just being there, it's being asked to do something.
And that ties into something T.S. Eliot said about how genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood. Ever feel that? Like you get it in your gut before your brain catches up.
Totally. It bypasses the logic and hits you right in the feels.
Exactly. Some poems give me chills even if I couldn't analyze them to save my life.
That's the power of language, right? To tap into something deeper.
And a lot of these quotes, they connect poetry to the big stuff, like life and death, power, even corruption.
Yeah, it's not all flowery language and pretty imagery.
This one's intense. JFK. When power leads man toward arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses.
Powerful stuff.
Right. It's like art holding up a mirror to society. And that feels more relevant than ever these days, don't you think?
Definitely. But then you have Leonard Cohen, totally different vibe. He said, poetry is just the evidence of life. If your life is burning well, poetry is just the ash.
Whoa. Way less cheery, huh?
Yeah, but it's still powerful. Poetry is the leftover bits after something intense has happened.
Not always pretty, but real.
Exactly.
Okay, now for a classic image. Percy Bysshe Shelley. A poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude. But are poets really like that anymore?
Right, like with social media and all that.
Yeah. Poets are out there, part of the world. It's not all solitary brooding these days.
It makes you wonder if that changes the poetry itself or just how it reaches people.
Makes you think about how poets actually write, with all these different ideas about what poetry is.
Right, like does the process reflect the goal?
Totally. And we've got Wordsworth's super famous definition. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility.
So you have that raw emotion, but then...
You gotta step back.
Yeah, find that calm space to shape it, make it art.
That's wild. Like
Yeah.
a recipe for beating writer's block almost. Find your tranquility, then write.
Huh, maybe. Though some of these other quotes, totally different vibe.
Like that Stephen Wright one. I was reading the dictionary. I thought it was a poem about everything.
Right. Hilarious, but also...
Kinda true. Poets see connections nobody else does.
It's that playful use of language.
Like kids, making up words but on purpose.
And then Audre Lorde, she nails both sides of it. Poetry is not only dream and vision, it is the skeleton architecture of our lives. A bridge across our fears.
Okay, that's deep.
Right. Poetry as this framework for our experiences.
Not just pretty words, but important.
Exactly. And speaking of important, we've got some quotes about the poet's role, not just the poems themselves.
Like, what's their job?
Yeah. Salman Rushdie said they should name the unnameable and point at frauds.
Calling out the BS, huh?
And James Joyce said poetry is a revolt against artifice.
So like keeping it real.
Exactly. Poets as truth tellers, but in this artistic way.
Makes sense. They notice things most people don't, right? Or maybe they're just brave enough to say it out loud. For sure. And, for all the serious stuff we've talked about, there's also a lot of playfulness in these quotes.
Oh, absolutely. Poetry isn't all doom and gloom.
Like Michael Franti, he said, every single soul is a poem.
Oh, wow.
Makes you see people differently, right?
Yeah, like everyone's got that depth to them.
And then there's Don Marquis. Gotta love this one. Publishing a volume of verse is like dropping a rose petal down the Grand Canyon and waiting for the echo.
Ouch. But also kind of accurate.
So true. All those poems out there, all hoping to make a sound. Speaking of sound, remember how we were talking about how, like, knowing something about the artist changes how you see their art.
Right, like that changes the whole experience.
Well, Bob Dylan said, flat out, "I consider myself a poet first and a musician second. I live like a poet and I'll die like a poet."
Changes how you hear those lyrics, huh?
Totally. Suddenly it's like, oh, poetry with music, not just songs. Man, we've covered so much ground today.
Right. From how poetry makes us feel all the way to what poets are supposed to do in the world.
And we laughed a little along the way, which is good. But still, feels like we barely scratched the surface.
I think that's part of the magic, though. You can't pin poetry down with one definition.
It's like trying to define love or something. You just know it when you see it.
Exactly. And everyone's experience of it is going to be different.
So out of all these quotes, was there one that really clicked for you? Like your personal take on what poetry is?
Ooh, tough one. They're all so good. I think that one from Audre Lorde about poetry being the skeleton architecture of our lives really stuck with me. How it's not just decoration, but like essential. What about you?
Man, it's a toss-up.
Uh,
Poe's rhythmical creation, the beauty, just sounds perfect. But then Franti's, every single soul is a poem. That's how I want to see the world, you know? And I think that's what we hope you get out of this.
yeah, maybe you'll look at poetry differently now or start noticing it in places you wouldn't expect.
Exactly. Because it's not just in books. It's in how people talk, the songs you love, even just noticing something beautiful in your day.
Yeah. Maybe we're all poets in our own way, just by living and experiencing stuff.
Maybe so. So on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of poetry, and keep an ear out for those echoes of beauty wherever you find them.